All right. Well, it's great to be with you all again. It's been a while. And we'll begin this time with a little time of meditation and prayer. So I invite you to assume your whatever position you use for prayer and meditation, become comfortable. And in this time, we focus on and contemplate the presence of God, which is the presence in all things and in us. God is life. So right now we become aware of this divine presence as life in our consciousness and in our bodies. Presence especially in the rhythm of our breathing. Feeling our breathing, we are feeling the divine presence of life. We are feeling our connection with the atmosphere and with all life. Divine life is one. And our experience of divine life in consciousness is always one with all life. So we seek to be aware of this divine unity, unity of life, unity of all being. We experience this divine unity as love, as our feelings of connections with others, as compassion, as the impulse to kindness. Kindness is a recognition of our oneness with others, so that we desire good not only for ourselves, but for others. We know that what we send forth returns to us. Every blessing we bestow, whether a blessing of thought or action, that blessing returns to us, for we are one. Contemplate the divine presence as love. And we bring into our awareness the people we know and love, first of all, to spark that quality, that divine quality in our consciousness. We think of those we love. As we think of them, we recognize the truth that they are one with the infinite, one with the divine life, one with the absolute good. As we think of them with love, we recognize divine love is in them. We seek to know the best ways, what is ours to do, to manifest greater good in the world, to express our love in positive and effective ways. We seek divine wisdom. And we are now knowing that that wisdom is already within us. So we become more still, more receptive to divine illumination, to the knowing of what is ours to do and the knowing of the truth. We seek this wisdom not anxiously, but in a state of calm assurance and peace, in a state of faith. Divine wisdom now guides me to do what is mine to do. I invite you to hold that thought now. Divine wisdom guides me to do what is mine to do. Then, in stillness and silence, be receptive not only to that wisdom and guidance, but to life and love, the infinite abundance of divine substance, the all good of God. Be open and receptive to all that Spirit has to reveal to you in this moment, in the stillness, in the silence. You're now experiencing the influx of divine life, light, and love. It is an energy and a light that comes from within, knowing and a faith and power. This knowing of the divine presence, we are also knowing that same presence is with and within all those we hold in our consciousness. This is prayer. And as we hold others in that awareness, we support them in the experience of the divine. So that at any given moment, they may suddenly realize the truth of their being. They may suddenly experience illumination or healing, or greater flow of supply, more harmony in their relationships and in their experience. The divine presence is flowing in each one as it is in us. In this consciousness, we are grateful. In this consciousness, we realize the Christ within, and it is in that nature, the Christ nature, the name of the Christ, that we pray and affirm our truth and know that it is so, and so it is. Amen. All right. Well, as I said, it's good to be back with you. I'm going to be with you for the next, for this week and the next 2 weeks, talking on the theme of spiritual keys for harmonizing the world. And the first topic that I've chosen on that is liberty and justice for all. And I will confess at the outset that I don't have all the answers on any of these questions. So I'm just going to suggest some ideas, share some thoughts, and hope that triggers for you some thoughts and some realizations in your own times of contemplation and in your own life. So I'm going to start with a fact about my life and about actually the lives of most of my generation, most of my fellow citizens of my generation in the United States. When we were in elementary school, one of the first things we learned was what was called the Pledge of Allegiance. So it was almost immediately impressed on us how important liberty and justice are, because I still remember, even though I haven't had to recite it in years, we recited it through most of grade school. I still remember the Pledge of Allegiance. You may or may not have been exposed to it, but it was I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. So that's where I got the title from my talk, Liberty and Justice for All, from this Pledge of Allegiance that I learned in grade school. And uh, I'm pretty sure that no one, when we first learned that pledge, understood what it was talking about. I don't think I don't think we necessarily knew what a pledge was. We certainly didn't know what allegiance was, but probably the most or indivisible, one nation under God, indivisible. Uh, and we didn't know what liberty and justice were. And I think that, over the years, of course, as we grew older, we came to understand the meaning of this pledge. And consequently, the at least the politicians of my generation, although the pledge has, continued to be taught in schools, the politicians of my generation are always using words related to the Pledge of Allegiance in their rhetoric. And it's true not only of politicians, but of pundits. They talk about liberty and justice and connected or synonymous ideas like freedom, fairness, equality, and so on. So we hear a lot of that. And I'm not really entirely persuaded that all the people who use those words know what they're talking about. That's that's not a that's not a judgment against their intelligence or anything. I think that liberty and justice are pretty deep ideas and the meaning of them is not always obvious. And yet, if we want to live in a truly harmonious world, most would agree that we cannot have that harmony without liberty or freedom and justice. That the more uh, oppression and aggression there is in the world, the more discord there is. And so, if we want harmony, we need to understand what true liberty and justice are and what we can do to maximize them in the world. Liberty implies that we have free will. Yet, for almost 3,000 years, philosophers and theologians have argued about whether or not humans have free will. And for the past few hundred years, scientists have weighed into the controversy. And during those same periods, philosophers, theologians, politicians, scientists have argued about the nature of justice, trying to define what it is, and of course, how can we create a just society and world? It seems like in every culture, whether you talk about India, China, any place in Asia, any place in Europe, no matter how far back you go in history, as soon as there's human thought, these ideas of freedom and justice are part of the conversation and part of the aspiration of humanity. But of course, if we do not have free will, there cannot really be either liberty or justice. After all, if my actions are not freely chosen, if I am just a puppet of God or natural laws, then there's really no rational justification for either rewarding or punishing me for my actions. Our usual ideas of justice involve either punishment or reward. Because that is so, the issue of freedom and justice, the issues or the nature of freedom and justice are inextricably linked. If we do not have free will, in a way, there's no sense in even really talking about it. The discussion is meaningless because we all just do what we have to do. So there have been arguments for determinism and against free will. And the arguments are actually fairly easy to state. They've put in various forms, but the essence of them are basically the same. So there's a theological argument for determinism. There have been some theologians, and this is especially true in Protestant history, but also in Hinduism and other religions. There have been some who have contended that because God is omnipotent, excuse me, because God is omnipotent, God controls everything, including human behavior. And that's basically the essence of the theological argument against free will. God controls everything, including our behavior. Surprisingly, the scientific argument is basically the same or practically the same. But instead of claiming that God controls everything, some scientists argue that natural physical laws determine everything, including human behavior. According to this view, in theory, everything is predictable if we just have enough information and enough understanding of physical laws. Everything is predictable and determined, including human behavior. Now, many of the philosophical arguments for determinism are about the same, again, as the theological and scientific arguments, but there is another extra one that you find in philosophy. That's also an argument that everything is determined. It's the argument that everything happens according to logical necessity, what is logically necessary. There's sort of the idea that all that can happen has to be logical, right? Either it's God's logic or just the very nature of logic of things that are necessarily true. So everything's determined by what's necessarily true. Again, there's no free will. Now, as you probably would guess, I reject all of these arguments. And I think I can see clearly what the error is in all of them. The error in the theological argument is that accepting the assumption of divine omnipotence, we assume that there is God and God is omnipotent, then God could create a universe in which humans and other creatures have free will. What could prevent God from doing that? Right? Just because God could control everything doesn't prove that God chooses to control everything. So, in other words, an omnipotent being could choose to create beings who have free will. This seems not to have occurred to the theologians who claimed that God would control everything. And maybe psychologically, they felt that if they had the power to control everything, they would. Okay? But that doesn't necessarily mean that an infinite spirit would behave in the same way. So, in other words, that argument doesn't really hold water. That because God is, oh, if there's an omnipotent God, then that omnipotent God must control everything, because that omnipotent God would have free choice whether or not to make creatures with free will or to control them. The error in the scientific argument is a little bit different. Part of it just is that it's an unproven assumption that everything is determined by physical laws. Just because some things can be predicted based on laws doesn't mean that everything is necessarily determined and predictable in the same way. This is an error that the philosopher William James pointed out about the science of his era. Basically, his point was this is just an unfounded assumption that everything is determined, that everything is predictable. Just because you can predict some things doesn't mean you can predict everything or that everything's determined. And of course, quantum physics, we now know, indicates that at the most microscopic level of the universe, which means everywhere, at the most microscopic level, the level of quarks and that sort of thing, events do not occur according to strict determinative laws. Strangely, this is one of the most certain things that we have in science, the thing that works sort of the best in describing the universe, according to most scientists. This quantum physics that says, well, things don't happen as a matter of law at this level, but as a matter of probabilities. So there's an element of randomness or chance. There's an element of freedom at the subatomic level of the universe. So for those reasons, the scientific argument for determinism doesn't really hold up either. I hope this isn't too much philosophy for you, but bear with me, okay? As for the notion of logical necessity, sort of the last one, since it is the case, and these philosophers would agree with this, that there are infinite number of possible forms and events, since it is the case, let's repeat that there are an infinite number of possible forms and events. So you can think about this in terms of possible objects, shapes, and things that can happen. Because that is infinite, the universe is irreducibly unpredictable because there is no end or limit to infinity. Therefore, you couldn't nail it down or confine it and to predict everything. So, for example, as just a weird little thought experiment, suppose there was a scientist sometime in the future who knew everything that could be known about my past behavior and my current physiology, basically knowing everything there is to know about me. Okay. So presumably that scientist could then predict my behavior. Now, suppose then the scientist um, wants to predict what number I would pick between 0 and infinity. So I'm going to write down a number on a piece of paper a number between 0 and infinity. Could the scientist predict my answer? Well, here's the thing with probabilities. The information that the scientist has about me is finite in amount. Okay. It may be vast, but it's still finite. I'm not sure there's a vast amount to know about me, but let's suppose that there is. Still, it's a finite amount of information. So the odds of correctly predicting the number I will choose is some finite number divided by infinity. Okay, that's how you do probabilities. The choices are divided by the choices are divided by uh, the number of possibilities. So, like the probability of predicting whether a coin's going to turn up heads or tails is 1 divided by 2. You 50-50 chance. Okay. But here's the problem with this experiment. Any finite number divided by infinity equals 0. So no matter how high the number is on the top of, say, the amount of information the scientist has, the outcome will always be a 0 probability that the scientist could correctly predict my choice. Since my choice is inherently unpredictable, it cannot be determined by logical necessity or by any other means, right? This wonderful idea of infinite possibilities, for me, is the proof of freedom, that we have free will, that we have liberty already. So I can only conclude that humans and other beings have free will. I'm not sure what other beings have it, but humans at any rate. But what is will? And how is it related to this idea of liberty? First of all, I know that a lot of people think of will as intention. But I don't think that will is really intention, because if I intend to do something in the future, that doesn't mean that I will actually do it. So all I'm doing when I'm intending something is willing to contemplate doing something in the future. It's not really the same as actually doing it. So I think our will, your will, my will, is really identical with whatever we direct our attention to. Wherever you direct your attention, that is your experience. For example, if I direct my attention to thinking about something, to my thoughts, I am willing in that point to think. I'm using my will to think. If I want to go somewhere and do something, I direct my attention to that and my body follows, so to speak, right? Have you ever noticed that? You don't really have to do a lot of thinking. You just direct your attention to moving, and notice that directing your attention to moving is different from intending to move. Okay? I can be sitting here intending to go outside and mow the lawn, but as long as I'm just intending it, I'm really just directing my attention to the thought of doing that and willing to think about it, but not really willing to do it. Okay. So wherever we direct our attention, that's where we're directing. That is an action of will, and wherever we direct our attention, that is what we experience, right? So everyone, I would say, is already free to do whatever they choose. And in that sense, nothing needs to be done to make us free. We already have the freedom to direct our attention wherever we want to, and consequently to think about or act in whatever way we want to. We are already free, even if we don't realize that, even if we don't perceive that. This is not to deny that free action is more difficult in some conditions than in others, right? But it's only to say we do have, no matter what the circumstances are, we have the freedom to direct our attention to whatever ideas or actions we choose. And our choices may be based on a number of different motivations. They might be just based on an intuition. One of the illusions, a common illusion that people have about liberty and government, is that government grants freedoms. In reality, government exists really to limit freedoms or to discourage certain kinds of behaviors and impose consequences for whatever the government officials deem to be undesirable behavior. Government doesn't grant freedoms. Freedoms, we already have the freedoms that the government, any freedoms that the government could grant us. Now, in the United States, we have our Constitution, which has a Bill of Rights, and it includes freedoms of belief and freedom of expression and religion and so on. But the truth is that by nature, we are already free to believe and to express our beliefs. So legal rights by the government really mean that we won't be arbitrarily punished for our beliefs and words. We have given a certain amount of latitude where we won't get into any legal problems. And we can see this very clearly, at least in the United States. I'm not familiar with Canadian law, so I can't really talk about that. But in the United States, there are certain legal limits on freedom of expression. There are certain kinds of expressions that can get you into legal trouble. The government then sort of, in effect, restricting your freedom. So, for example, it's illegal to commit libel or slander or perjury or lying to obstruct justice or threaten harm or incite panic or incite riots. All of those are illegal forms of expression and you can be punished. Those are discouraged by the laws. Those are sort of limited by the laws. You can still do those things, but you have to be willing to accept the consequences if you are caught. And even the much vaunted freedom of religion, that is one of those freedoms that politicians talk about from time to time. Freedom of religion is not absolute either in the United States. Right? If, for example, if you were to be, if your religion involved the practice of human sacrifice, I'm pretty sure there would be legal consequences for that. And freedom of religion wouldn't be sufficient defense. Or if your religion involved killing whatever infidels you see, if you acted on that belief, I'm pretty sure the government would have something to say about it. And so it's illegal to use certain types of drugs in the context of one's religious practice, and those laws vary. So my point really just is that the government doesn't really ever grant us liberty or freedom. That we already have. What the government does is try to put restrictions or try to have consequences for actions. And of course, all of our actions always have consequences, not necessarily legal, but some kind of. So before we can determine what kinds of laws are just, we need to understand what justice is, right? Granting that we have freedom to act, what about justice? If we tried to determine what specific laws, policies, and structures would make for a just society, this conversation would be endless and unresolved. Obviously, don't have time to try to figure out what all the laws ought to be just. So we have to think about it in much more general terms, in terms of principle. So I invite you to consider a simple and primitive idea of justice is this: whenever the consequences of an action are equivalently experienced by the agent of the action, it is just. So justice is equivalence of action and consequence applied everywhere to all people equally. So in other words, somebody does something, it has a consequence, and that consequence is the justice. Okay. Whether it's legally imposed or imposed by life, that would be justice. So if you harm others, then receive equivalent harm in return, that is just. If you benefit others and receive equivalent benefit in return, that is just, or that is justice. This very, very basic, simple idea of what justice is. Now, interestingly, it happens that that is roughly the way nature works. For everyone, everywhere, it is in terms of the laws of nature, for every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction, right? And this law applies everywhere to all people. It is just in that sense. Likewise, the law of gravity works the same for everywhere, everyone, everywhere, all the time. So, in a way, nature provides a model for the idea of human justice, the equivalency of action and reaction. So, if we make laws and policies on this principle and can somehow enforce those policies and laws equally and universally, then we would have a just government, a government that reflects the principle of justice. Sounds simple, doesn't it? Of course, when we get down to cases, we see it's not so simple. Even if our laws perfectly reflected the principle of justice, there would still be the challenge of, for example, catching and convicting people who commit crimes. There's also the challenge of determining what is the appropriate consequence for a crime and figuring out whether or not a person who's arrested actually committed the crime, and so on. There's this idea of justice we can see even in the Hebrew scriptures, in the famous Jewish scriptures, in the famous saying, "An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth." It's an attempt to impose just consequences. And if you think about it in those terms, one of the things that is commonly um, imposed as a consequence of breaking the law is imprisonment. Imprisonment. However, if you think about it in a sort of very literal and simple way, the only crime for which being in prison would be equivalent to the action, to the crime, in effect, is if someone kidnapped and held someone for a certain amount of time against their will. That would be unlawful imprisonment or whatever. That would be the only case, really, in which you'd have this sort of obvious and equal sort of consequence. So it's extremely difficult when we think about, even when we think about justice in very simple terms, to figure out how the laws ought to work in order to reflect this value of justice. Well, that's at the political level. But let's consider this basic idea of justice from a spiritual viewpoint. The first thing that comes to mind for me is the idea of karma. The Hindu word karma is kind of roughly the equivalent to our Western sort of notion of justice. And the concept of karma is very appealing in a lot of ways. For one thing, this idea of karma, involves the idea of reincarnation. And so it explains unequal conditions at birth. Why are we born under unequal conditions? Some born rich, some born poor, and so on and so forth. So forth. Karma just says, well, these are the consequences of the actions from your previous existence, right? But it is the idea of karma is a spiritual law, mirrors the idea of the laws of nature. For every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. So it is, as I say, it can be very appealing because it explains a lot of things and it assures us that there's a sort of justice going on in the universe, even if we don't see it in outer ways. Of course, it's not particularly appealing to people who don't believe in reincarnation, because in that case, the karma idea doesn't really work. And there's another issue with it, I suppose, is a problem that if we don't recall our past lives, how can we learn anything from them? How can we understand the conditions of our birth? So a lot of people try to remember past lives, people who believe in karma. So, but basically, the idea of karma is a spiritual idea that there's justice in the universe that is a kind of a justice that um, a justice that can be maybe in a future experience in a future life rather than in this one. I'd also mention, of course, Jesus, who stated the principle of justice in simplest terms. What he said was, the measure you give will be the measure you receive. This idea of that whatever we put out into the universe is what comes back to us. Whatever you give will be the measure you receive. It's a nice, clear statement of this idea of justice and this idea of law. Um, so we do have this challenge, right? If we accept the idea that there is a divine justice, whether we call it karma or whether we call it the principle of measure for measure, as we might describe the way Jesus stated it, we still have this challenge of the idea of future consequences and not seeing what they are. And we have this tendency to look at justice or consequences as always being something that appears in the outer, in events. So I'm going to take another look at another spiritual perspective on justice that's found in the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson. To me, Emerson has a really profound insight into the spiritual meaning and the true meaning of this idea of justice and the teachings of Jesus. So I highly recommend reading these essays I'm going to make reference to. I'm going to make a couple references to a couple of essays. I highly recommend reading the whole thing to really get what he's saying here. But I have a few quotations that sort of give you the sense of sort of the important point. He talks about this idea of compensation. That's the name of one of the essays, compensation. And one of the ways he describes it is that for everything you have missed, you have gained something else. And for everything you gain, you lose something. So he gives all these examples of how if you get this, then you don't get this experience. That kind of the idea of life is a trade-off. The choices you make, you gain certain things from the choices you make, but you also miss out on other possibilities. So it's like if I chose to, or I like to say I was called to, but I chose at any rate to go into unity ministry, and therefore I missed out on the life of being, for example, a lawyer, which was one of my sort of original intentions. Uh, when I was a kid, what I really wanted to be was a baseball player, but I didn't seem to really have the right talent or something or the drive to do that. But later on, so the point is, it's a trade-off. When you choose one career, you're missing another one. And he goes on and talks about and mentions all kinds of different areas of life in his essay where you can see that everything you gain, you miss something. That's the balance of the universe. So then he says also in compensation that justice is not postponed. Perfect equity adjusts its balance in all parts of life. The dice of God are always loaded. So he's taking a position in this essay that just consequences are not something that happens or that always happens in the future, that it's postponed. He takes really the position that justice is instantaneous, but because he looks at it not in terms of outer conditions, but in terms of the soul. He says, and the nature of the soul is the compensation for the inequalities of condition. In the nature of the soul is the compensation for the inequalities of condition. So again, he's looking at what is it, the way I put it is, what is it that we're carrying around with us? Okay. We carry around our actions and the consequences of our actions in our soul, even if we don't always see a sort of outer manifestation of it. And this point, I think Emerson makes even more clearly in his famous Divinity School address. So I'm going to share what he says in the Divinity School address. He gave this at Harvard. He was invited to speak there, and he told his listeners that they should leave behind all the doctrines and dogmas and go out and express the truth, in effect, express the truth as you see it. And because he said that, he wasn't invited back to speak at Harvard for 30 years. They held that against him for a long time. But anyway, here's what he says in the Divinity School address. In the soul of man, there is a justice whose retributions are instant and entire. He who does a good deed is instantly ennobled. He who does a mean deed is, by the action itself, contracted. If a man is at heart just, then insofar is he God. The safety of God, the immortality of God, the majesty of God do enter into that man with justice. If a man dissemble, deceive, he deceives himself and goes out of acquaintance with his own being. So you see what he's getting at here, that regardless of what's happening in the outer circumstances, when we, for example, express love, we are instantly receiving the karma, if you will, of love. We are instantly in our souls ennobled expanded by that act of kindness, as the daily word spoke of today. By seeing that spiritually, we, all of us, are already free, and that the universe is already just, the level of nature and at the deepest level of the soul, our perspective on life shifts to a higher level. We are set free from anxiety and anger about perceived injustices or violations of our freedom. We can then see clearly that what we truly want is not so much the establishment of liberty and justice, which, as I've contended, we already have, but what we truly want is to use our freedom and the divine law to maximize harmony in our lives and in the world. Trusting that justice now is, we can focus on how to minimize oppressive conditions and maximize equal opportunities in society. By willing that, by putting our attention on it, by doing what is ours to do, we can align with the law of justice by considering what actions and policies will maximize beneficial consequences through the laws that we write. Emerson recognized this truth. He trusted in a just universe. And he and his associates chose to act. They chose to act for equal treatment in human society and for spiritual illumination. So even though he held justice already is, he recognized that there is a need for us to work towards more and more positive conditions using this law. And so Emerson and his associates spoke out against slavery, and they didn't just speak out against it, but they participated in the Underground Railroad to set free enslaved people or to help set them free. They also advocated for women's rights and practiced the equal treatment of wisdom in their association of transcendentalists. So likewise, in our times, we can do what we feel called to do to harmonize the world. We can support organizations and causes that work for illumination, for equalization of opportunities, for the upliftment of human consciousness. We can seek divine guidance and strive to live in alignment with divine love and wisdom in our use of the law and a use of free will. The spiritual principles of healing and prosperity apply also to harmonizing the world. Just as we can be healers by holding ourselves and others in a consciousness of divine life and harmony, just as we can increase prosperity by holding to the truth of infinite substance, we can also be world harmonizers by holding to the truth of liberty and justice for all, the recognition that that is already truth for us. Just by holding the consciousness that divine freedom and justice are omnipresent, we can contribute to raising the whole consciousness of humanity into awareness and manifestation of liberty and justice for all. We put our attention on these divine truths of liberty and justice, we experience them. Because again, it is an act of free will. Where we direct our attention, that determines what we experience. And so I invite you to hold to this higher thought that liberty and justice is already ours, and that we can use those divine gifts to make a better and more harmonious world. Thank you.
That is quite a talk. Ooh. I am glad we have recorded it so we can listen to it again